Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 485th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, joined by my co-host, Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I had a great Thanksgiving. How was yours, Mason?
It was good. I went and saw my grandparents, hung out with them and their relatives adjacent to that stuff, and that was really fun. Then came home, got to commentate some NRG on the weekend, which was really fun, and now we get to talk Magic with you. So, pretty good weekend, all things considered.
Yeah, I'm sad that the coverage on Saturday fell through. I was really excited to do that with you, but that it is what it is. A wise man once said to me.
It's true. And, we're still going to get those matches up on YouTube with commentary. It's just a matter of figuring out when the time to do that is. They're all recorded. We want to have those up on YouTube at NRG. So that's really exciting. The end of the race was really exciting. And Pioneer is very hype right now. So I'm very excited to hop into that. But before we do, we need to do Always Improving. And a quick shout out to Spencer, who's getting to have a really cool experience with his son right now at a basketball game, which is really hype. They won free tickets. I don't know if you heard that from outside the Patreon Discord. I don't know if you post on social media yet, but that was exciting. Hopefully they're having a lot of fun. We're glad that y'all get to have that sort of, awesome memory with your child. But, what's a real memory? Abe is Always Improving. And you're up first, buddy. How'd you always improve this week?
Yeah, so, my overall Always Improving is, and it might be this way for a bit, especially with the PT, inching closer day by day. Has just been, continuing to broaden my range this week. It's been playing a bit of off beaten path decks, especially in the face of Pioneer going through some drastic changes that we'll talk about in a bit here. But really getting into playing, I played some of the mono red Infuriate Combat Trick Fling deck, a really low to ground slide deck to see what was up with that, why that was winning. Played a lot of the more established stuff too that I hadn't had a chance to play yet, like Blue White Lotus, and also just incorporating more note taking on the matches I'm actually playing, because I've been working with starting to work with people to make sure that information is not only good for me to know, but also being able to transfer it, and also just uncovering the where it is I want to continue to gain understanding, or hopefully shedding light on some things or raising questions from the group I'm working with, to kind of be able to play with a little more intentionality around answering those. So yeah, that's been me. Just a lot of Pioneer this week. How about you, Mason?
It has been Pioneer season. Getting ready for the RC and everything. Obviously, this Geological Appraiser deck and Discover in general has really popped up on the map, and has been something that everyone's really talking about and trying to get their hand on. And so just trying to get a feel for how strong I think that deck actually is, how much do we need to respect it, what is the right kind of stuff to do with that, has I spent a lot of my time. And then also trying to kind of build decks and be okay, listen, if this deck is really good and it's moving the metagame in this direction, is there stuff I can play? And I ended up sharing with you, and I posted a little bit on Twitter, but this blue-white kind of Yorion mid-range deck that had Trisari Tidebinder and Spell Queller and Reflector Mage. And while ultimately I think that deck is not quite there against enough of the format, it did have some cool stuff going on, and it was cool to be okay, these kind of things do work. You can have game plans like this, but I need to find a more consistent game plan versus the rest of the field, or maybe tune this. And so that has been a lot of where my time has been spent, is trying to figure out what exactly is good versus Discover, what is good versus the metagame as it moves around Discover, because things are changing. The Discover deck is good enough to really move the metagame in certain directions, and has eliminated things like green from the format almost entirely, right? So if that changes, what else changes about the format?
Yeah, I think it's you showed me that deck, and I think it made a lot of sense to me why that deck could be good, especially in the context of, the number one thing this deck had problems with, and even just the blue-white colors tend to have problems with, especially playing a smaller mid-range plan, is that they can't compete with Llanowar Elves. That just creates too much of an advantage early, and it could be time, and really just exploring kind of what I've been trying to do too, is finding opportunities in the format to do something different. And even if it doesn't always pan out, or you just learn that Spell Queller and Reflector Mage are well positioned, or maybe Yorion going over the top of some people is, no matter what you end up playing, like the things you're going to uncover there, I think are going to be pretty helpful for you in the next couple of weeks heading to the RC, just so you know like what the successful pieces of that game plan are, right? You kind of have an idea of where there might be opportunity, but where that actually is, based on what that deck's doing, and how it works might be. I mean, it's definitely just going to be something that it can really set you apart. I'm a big believer in that, so I hope that serves you well.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. And, it's also a thing where, like, long term, maybe the answer isn't now, but like in 12 months from now, we kind of end up in another similar spot where something like this happens. And I have a little bit of information now, right? Of kind of like what was right, what was wrong. I can pick up from there. So, there's never really wasted time when you explore other things like this. So much of it's just learning about what's powerful in the format, what sort of matters, how are you, like, what axes are you playing on, and then working from there. So, with that all in mind, let's jump into our main topic, Abe, because this week it is all about Pioneer. We're already talking about Pioneer, so let's just hop into it, because I'm sure everyone's kind of biting at the bit here, as we are 2 weeks away from the time y'all are hearing this episode from the RC in Atlanta for the United States. We've had a lot of the other RCs. We've had a lot of data, and a lot has changed about Pioneer since we last checked in. And Abe, do you want to give people kind of the breakdown really quick on what is this Discover/Quintorius combo decks that have popped up, in case there may be someone who hasn't been super plugged into social media due to the holidays?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that's happened to Pioneer in, like, I guess since Lost Guidance Ixalan is that the Discover mechanic has kind of enabled the same deck building principles you might see in Modern in decks like Living End or Rhinos to take place, but rather than just resolving the singular spell and things being like, well, I play a bunch of 2-mana things or fake 2-mana things or fake 1-mana things with like split cards and whatever. It does the same thing, but the cost is instead usually like 5 or 4, depending, because of the Dinosaur, the 7/6 that is Discover 5, Quintorius, which is a 5-mana Planeswalker that discovers 4, and the Geomancer, which is 3/2 that discovers 3. And so there's a couple different builds of this deck, but the basic idea is that you cast one of these things that discovers. Your deck has, various clone, like either if it was Quintorius or the Quintorius decks, they play like Spark Doubles and Clever Impersonators to make more copies of Quintorius and then drain you out by casting them and triggering Quintorius' static ability. The Geomancer builds, they have Eldritch Evolutions and Glasspool Mimics to then go get the dinosaurs and then end with a bunch of creatures in play, and they go get Doomscar Titan, which is a 6-mana 4/4 that gives them all +1/+1 haste. So then that comes into play, and like you're just attacking for lethal, and they can do that as soon as turn 3, thanks to using like Magma Opus and Creative Outburst to be able to like discard, then make a treasure, and then just cast this 4-mana creature that lets them really just dump their deck into play. It's kind of like it's the first time I would say I've seen, maybe I guess since like Oops All Spells in Pioneer, things be this this uninteractive in a lot of ways, where like, I mean, that you can interact. Like if you just have a single removal spell for the Appraiser or for Quintorius, like a way to remove it from play, you're going to stop them from chaining off the clones or the evolutions to go off. So like a single piece of interaction can go pretty far, but the deck is really resilient and also very difficult to play around because it costs so little compared to the rest of what's going on in the format that it can be really dangerous. So it's basically pushed out some of the old mainstays that were better at winning these games that were happening on the board and not really interacting in the way that these decks are asking for. So like Mono Green, for example, there's not much Mono Green can do about a deck that's going to consistently combo off on turn 3 or 4 and just kill them, because they don't really consistently combo off on turn 3 or 4 themselves. And so, just things like this have really changed a lot of the, not just the dynamic in like just this deck being good, but also what decks can't really exist in that ecosystem, and therefore some of the top best decks that we've seen for the last few months have kind of been taken out of the equation. That's opened up room for new decks to take the top slot and and also like these decks themselves kind of vying for the top spot. So a lot has happened since Lost Caverns of Ixalan, quite a bit.
Yeah, this is the first time I think we've had a Pioneer episode. God, at least since you've joined the show, Abe, where it's not going to end with we're having a segment where you and I talk about like, yeah, let's just play green, or Spencer's like, yeah, why are we not playing the Elf deck, right? Like, I feel like that's been a thing about our podcast has always been, no matter what, the green deck has been pretty reasonable. You know, that has kind of been a through line, and this is the one time where it's like, yeah, I think it's not the worst choice ever if you played green and you didn't run into these geological or Quintorius decks, the Discover decks as we'll call them. I think you would do fine, you know, but you're just going to die to these Discover decks. And there's not much you can really do to change your deck in order to fix that. You know, your Karn can solve some of the problems, but it takes too long to get Karn down and get something like a Damping Sphere, like a Stone Brain, out on your opponent. So it's a real problem.
Yeah, there's not many green counter spells or green, shocks, like efficient removal spells you can use to try to break up that combo. And it shows. Like, I think that the combo-y nature of things has really changed the texture of what matters in Pioneer. I think we'll really get into that when we get into some of these decks.
For sure. Well, I think we should start by talking about Discover, the Geological Appraiser deck, which is like the Bloodbraid adjacent, that's the 4-mana creature, and then the Quintorius, that's the Elephant Planeswalker, and sort of where we land on each of them, because I think they are unique decks, and I think clumping them together would be a disservice, especially because I think, you know, we talked a little bit before the show about this. I think we both kind of agree that we think one is a little bit better than the other, and they definitely have different strengths too, so I'll sort of start things off here. I have the incredibly hot take, Abe, that I think Discover, specifically the Geomancer deck. I think Geomancer is better than Elephant, so the Bloodbraid Elf variant. And I think that it is a good deck at worst. You know what I mean? Like, there's always hype whenever something like this comes out. The hype goes through the roof. It becomes really hard to gauge what's going on. I think the floor for the Geoform deck is it is one of the better decks, if not the best deck in Pioneer. And it is something you have to respect going forward and has done things that we talked about, like pushed Mono Green out of the format. I think it is a 1-card combo, and once you resolve one of your Discover things, you maybe sometimes don't actually win the game on the spot that turn, but often, you know, if you got very unlucky and drew your Doomscar Titan, you're still, and you had your, Galta in hand as well, because there is some amount of built-in protection from this. If you had both those in your hands from bad draw steps and you kept to turn 3, you're still putting like 38 power on the board, which is so hard for every deck in Pioneer to beat. Even the control decks, you know, if you're on the draw, your verdict isn't going to come in time for this. So I think the Geoformer deck is very, very good. I think it's changed what the bar is for Pioneer, and the interaction that you need to play is very different. Like, I've got this Rakdos deck pulled up on my other screen here that I'm going to play that's, you know, a little weird. I have these Torch the Towers as a 4 of and Fatal Push as a 2 of. And maybe that's going to go to a 3 and 3, but I need to have things that can actually stop the combo early. Because you can just die very easily with a Fatal Push in hand because you can't turn a Revolt. So, I think the long story short is this deck is very, very good. I think Discover Elephant is also good, but it's much slower and its fail rate is much higher. And so it has me much lower on it. I still think it's like a reasonable deck or whatever, but I'm not like, okay, this might be one of the best decks, if not the best deck in the format. I think it's just a solid deck that does better against permanent based hate due to cards like Leyline Binding.
Yeah, I think that it's important to kind of get into the distinction between these decks. It's not only, not only what they're using to discover and then combo into their finish. It's also like what the pieces around it are. So the Quintorius build, the Elephant build, has it plays the Black Virtue, the like -3/-3 gain 2 life. It plays Leyline Binding, so it has a few more answers. Sometimes they play like the Crab from Neon Dynasty you can channel to like as a counter spell. It plays Greater Tanuki and Beanstalk Giant to like ramp and get a turn ahead. I think it's better at kind of playing a game that breaks down. Where maybe they can't reliably resolve a Quintorius or they don't draw it, they can kind of just be ramping to cast big things. Whereas the Geomancer deck kind of its plan B that really I think developed over the last like week and a half since those two decks met in the finals of the Pioneer Showcase the week of release is that it has like, its plan A is I'm going to resolve one of these discover spells and just win. I'm a straight up combo deck. Plan B is that it has like some torrential gear hulks to go with the kind of Magma Opus stuff going on. In addition to like being able to just Eldritch Evolution in the middle of the chain for Gear Hulk to do something else. And that's been really kind of like the most alarming thing to me about that deck that really makes me interested in seeing kind of where things go with it, is that from where we were at the showcase, like after the showcase challenge, where okay, now it's a known quantity, the regional championships are coming up for multiple regions, how are people going to react, is that the Quintorius decks couldn't really adapt or be more flexible, and the Appraiser decks, they found ways to make their deck even better in the games that are like getting away from them by kind of adding more layers and dimensions to their game plan. And I think there's still a lot of room for exploration there too. So it's really it's like really cool to see it kind of happening in real time. But even just looking at the win rates from like Japan, the Japan RC comes to mind, as that was the one where the results came in first just because of time zones. But Quintorius was, I think, the most played deck in that tournament, and it boasted a 39% win rate. The Geological Appraiser combo decks, they, I think, ended with like somewhere in the mid 50% win rate, like one of the better decks to have played for the tournament. And both were equally known quantities. Now, whether or not people respect it in the same way, or they kind of prepared more for the Quintorius deck, I think is a little bit irrelevant because they have the same interaction points just about. I think Quintorius is a little bit more fragile because like you can spell pierce Quintorius and you can't spell pierce an Appraiser. But overall, like a lot of people's plans would have a Torch the Tower or a Shock or a Wild Slash or be able to stomp, whatever the discovering permanent was, if it was something that wasn't the dinosaur. And just seeing how, like, knowing that's one of the rules of engagement for the tournament, only shut one of these decks down kind of says a lot to me about how good that other deck is and how much pressure it puts on to say, okay, you need to keep a hand that has a way to interact with me comboing. It has to be like a removal spell, maybe a counter spell from Eldritch Evolution, something like that on as early as turn 3, or else, I'm just going to win the game. I'm just going to chump check you and you might lose. Or those decks now being able to say, okay, I'll just hold on until you have to leave up this mana all the time. And it's kind of like a 1-card Splinter Twin situation, which is, it seems too good for Modern on the quantity that having to always have removal up or always have a piece of interaction up is cumbersome and hard on the format to keep up with. So I think that just the efficiency in a format, especially like Pioneer, where things cost so much to interact, like we're talking about, you have to play more Torch Towers than Fatal Pushes now to try to keep up with that. But that's like one of the only really efficient answers is to play like a 1-mana piece of removal. It's not like Modern where there's a ton of ways to interact at instant speed for every color with whatever's going on that's unfair. This is really, you have to be able to fight over exactly this one card or this one spell. And if you don't, then you will just lose the game. And I think that's really, really tough for decks to compete with. It's really impressive how far these decks have come in just a couple of weeks and how much room for improvement I think there still is. I think it was, I was reading a thread today on Twitter by one of the players who played it in Japan. It was Kenta Hirane. And he talked about just like a lot of the card choice breakdowns and why to play this deck instead of like the Quintorius version or vice versa. And he really goes in depth about the fact that he says, yeah, maybe it's like not going to be the best deck for a while. Like it's not going to be like something that's dominating the format, but there's still so much room that he's identifying for how it can improve that I think, especially with the RC coming up, there's no reason why, and with PT coming up too, there's no reason why I can't see it getting even better from here. And I think that's a little scary because what you're saying is true. I don't think it can be. It's kind of like seeing a new Boros Convoke with higher potential unveil in front of our eyes, and as we'll get to, like Boros Convoke is one of the best, like one of the most solid decks in Pioneer right now. So it's really cool.
Yeah, it's a really cool and wild time, and there's just a lot of pressure on players, to like figure this out. And I think the deck is very good. I would not be surprised if I end up like just not being happy with anything else in Pioneer and be like, listen, prove it to me. You know what I mean? I'm going to come in here with the deck I think is maybe should be banned or whatever. Like there's so much pressure here. Let's see what happens. And like you mentioned, this all happened in 1 week. How much innovation is going to come in the 2 weeks before deck registration, right? So a lot of interesting stuff going on. We do need to move on from that deck, though, because I think we could end up having a whole episode just about it, to be honest. But, so this has had some knock-on effects. Talk about how Mono Green has died. And then Boros Convoke is a deck that we're going to bring about in a second. But really, the other big winner and something that players rushed to was Blue-White Control, and specifically the Lotus Field Control deck. And I'm going to sort of quickly talk about the Lotus Field Control deck here, because I think one thing that players do, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on the same, because I don't think you and I had this conversation before, is there is a deck that comes out and they want to beat that deck, right? And so the question becomes like, okay, how do we beat the Quintorius or the Geological, Discover deck? What do I do? And they pick a deck that can beat it, or it has some strength against it, right? So in the case of this control deck, your counter spells stop it. Discover is different than Cascade because this creature's actually enter into the battlefield. So that means your counter spells are strong, which also means your strict proctors that make your Lotus Fields work also stop this, and then you have your discontinuities. Your farewells are strong. So there's like a lot of good things about the deck. But there's this problem that I personally have with it, and I have with Blue-White Control a little bit as well, which is, but your deck isn't still good enough before, right? You can't beat the rest of what's going on. And even if this is the best deck and the thing to be doing, the rest of the format still exists. And, maybe the Discover decks make up 40% of the metagame, but there's still 60% left, and you have to be able to beat those decks. And so players have flocked to Blue-White, flocked to Lotus Field Control, and, there are some impressive elements in that sort of head-to-head, but I personally believe it's like, doesn't work versus the rest of the field, and that's really not a great place to be, in my opinion. It just kind of puts you in a very bad position where Blue-White proper at least does have things, I think, better game versus the rest of the field while being a little worse versus Discover. But the problem is the Blue-White deck doesn't like actually win the game, and so often just falls apart because it's so cumbersome and so clunky. So I'm kind of a Blue-White hater. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts on all this are, Abe.
Yeah, so actually have been really impressed by the Blue-White Lotus list when I've played them. It's one of the decks I've been working with a bit because I thought they had a lot of promise of kind of solving a problem of Blue-White being just, perennially too fair to exist, especially in a format like Pioneer, but, adding the ability to, like, have a fast Lotus Field to like push you ahead or start having, making your Teferi Hero of Dominaria is actually oppressive to land because they're not things that you can actually get off the board. Like being able to untap with like 4 to 6 mana every time you plus your Teferi is basically like having a Wilderness Reclamation in your control deck again, and Wilderness Reclamation, for those who don't recall, is banned in the format for different reasons, but it's a lot to be able to untap with that much mana. And specifically, like looking over the Japanese RC lists, I was really, really impressed with the list that made top 8 for the Blue-White Lotus decks, because I think that it's catching wins in a lot of directions. Like it has good game against a lot of the things that are, bubbling up to handle like a new world of Pioneer. But it also just gets to play, like, Tail's End is actually quite good in a lot of spots if you know what you're doing with it. So, like, obviously you can use it to counter a Discover trigger, in addition to countering Quintorius, or using it to set up your own Lotus Fields. But you can also, like, I used it against Boros Convoke to counter their Recruiter trigger that's going to give all their things haste, and then like untap and just cast a lockdown or cast a farewell or sunfall and like use that to stabilize. So there's a lot of applications for some of these cards that otherwise you'd think maybe are kind of specific and tied to what's going on with kind of like finicky with their own deck. But like being able to play a deck that's just a lot of temporary lockdowns, cantrips to find them, like hands that can go impulse into the temporary lockdown, they're really against Boros Convoke, which is one of the strongest decks in the current world of Pioneer right now, in my opinion. And overall, like the blue-white control decks are really well equipped to handle a world in which people are not getting ahead of them on mana in a real consistent way. Like one of the things that made blue-white so hard for me to think about justifying playing was that the Rakdos matchup wasn't like all that guaranteed. The Rakdos deck is really good. It was everywhere and was really good at kind of muscling through the things that blue-white was doing and making it show how clunky the blue-white deck is. But with less of that and less of mono green, where like the Llanowar Elves decks could really just make it embarrassing to be playing a bunch of tap lands and like absorbs, because by the time you're able to do anything to wreck the opponent, you might be so far behind that you're effectively, the game's already over. There's less of that, and I think that specifically the Lotus Field stuff is pretty strong at like breaking the dynamic and giving you draws that kind of pass the like the random garbage of the format test, where like you're not losing to random things you should be beating if you think your deck's good, because you're able to outmuscle them and like really do something unfair. So I don't know how much you've played with the Blue-White Lotus deck, but I would say maybe give it another look, because like at least for me, it's felt pretty impressive in the confines of being a control deck. Like as much as Blue-White control can only ever be so good, if you think of this as like a to protect Teferi ramp deck that has enough ways to do that and keep the game from being over, and even doing things like sometimes you're just Nexus Fate. Sometimes you have 2 Lotus Fields, a Teferi, and like some discontinuities that have accrued in your hand, and you're just like plus Teferi, end your turn, untap, like develop my board, plus my Teferi again, end your turn again, and just like, well, now it doesn't matter what you did. Like the game's just over. So yeah, I've been actually pretty impressed by that deck. The regular Blade lists, not so much, but Lotus specifically, I think, has a lot of capability to do enough that's unfair. I have a little bit of Parmesan in my blue-white deck that it's up there on my list of things to consider for the RC.
Sure. I think one thing that I do like about the blue-white deck that I did not highlight well that you did, which is that it does have the ability to actually win and take over. Right? I kind of mentioned blue-white proper just kind of sits there and does nothing, and blue-white Lotus Field like does have the ability to overwhelm its opponents and actually end the game, right? And I think that is really good. I do think that, to me, the pieces when they come together work incredibly well, and sometimes it's just so awkward, your games, and like your mana is really bad, and I don't know. I have played a little bit. It has never super impressed me. I don't know. I just, maybe I'm just a hater though. Maybe that's just it. Like,
for what it's worth, I think that the strict Proctor builds like have gotten worse, and that's what I think a lot of the decks were initially. I think now Tail's End
it's just
being a serviceable spell in the format in a lot of spots makes it a lot easier. Like the fact that's a card that can just cover you getting like Discover comboed as a 2-mana counter spell for that, and also be your your plus, like your I'll establish my Lotus Field spell. I think that does go pretty far in making the deck gain that little bit of edge.
That's
the fact that I think there's a lot of like small things in the way it's built that if you're playing the right configuration, and I think right now could be one of the best times to play a deck full of Tail's Ends, then you get rewarded. But
I definitely believe what you're saying. Also, do you play that Citadel card, like the weird tap land cave?
So I haven't. That's something that's on my list of things to try in the archetype, is seeing how many of things like that are like good, or with Thespian stages and stuff. Like, how good is it to have this land that makes my other lands activate abilities a bit cheaper? I have seen not a lot of consensus on
Mm-hmm.
what the number should be. Like the list that I was talking about from the Japanese RC played 0. I've seen Jujubee and Moto play 4. And I think there's not quite a consensus in whatever hive mind exists for that archetype. But like one of the things on my list things to do is kind of play around with the number of those and see how they feel, because there is just a weird thing that happens when you play Thespian stage where you want to be able to copy your Lotus Field and do something on like turn 4. But it's hard to have that many lands and do that.
Yeah.
And also sometimes you want to have like double white for temporary lockdown, but you can't really play that many white sources when you need a blue source on 2 to be able to like discontinuity or Tail's End. But that kind of solves in both ways too, of being like a pick your own land. So it's something to play around with. I don't think it's like been that significant improvement.
Yeah, it looked to me like almost like it was costing people more games with just being another tap land and just being awkward on their mana. So that's why I brought it up, because it felt like if they weren't playing it like on turn 1, it was really costing them like a significant amount, or like a turn where they were able to do something like, you know, lock down plus develop this. You know what I mean? So I was just curious, kind of like, because I thought maybe part of the reason is I'm seeing a lot of people play a lot of them and you are not. You know what I mean? And if that was the case, there would be so much difference in what we were talking about. That we're almost talking about different archetypes. You know what I mean? Or like different decks, I should say. So that's what I was just curious about. But it's interesting, for sure. So yeah, I mean, a little bit of, you know, descent in the ranks here when it comes to blue-white, but that's, you know, a lot of what Magic is, and it's going to be really interesting to see sort of how that plays out. I will say, like, I want to talk about Convoke here real quick, but you know, Phoenix is, I think, a really good deck. I've played it for lots of the RCs, but like with all the blue-white running around, I'm very anxious to like pick up the traditional Phoenix deck. But before we talk about that, I do want to talk about Convoke, because we've been mentioning it a lot. And Abe, it sounds like you're very high on Convoke. So what are your thoughts on the Convoke deck?
Yeah, I think the Convoke deck gets to play by the new rules of the format, which are that speed matters a lot, and get to do so with a lot of consistency. And I don't know, it is just a really good deck that has gotten more from the last couple sets than it had even when it was like a breakout deck. With like Warden of the Inner Sky being a really, really strong way to use a lot of the extra material you accrue when you're not drawing like Gleeful Demolitions and stuff. Imidane's Recruiter being you know, a little more consistent than Bushwhacker, and also hitting a little bit harder on its own and having the adventure attached. And overall, just like seeing this deck become a lot more refined. I know it got like second place in the challenge on like the early challenge on Sunday, or it was the late challenge on Saturday. But it is so consistently good. I know it also won the energy too, right? It's just so consistently able to execute its game plan that and able to play like a little bit of interaction for whatever's going on, right? Like it can have some answers for like anything, but still stay on its game plan of creatures, which, as we say a lot on the show, have a really low fail rate.
Yep. I don't know if this will be a surprise or not to you, Abe. If I had to play tomorrow for the RC, this is my pick. I think the Convoke deck is great. I think I maybe end up on the wrong side of history with the Geological Appraiser, and maybe I get some egg on my face, but I think the Convoke deck is so good. You get like, I think people underestimate that this deck just like very often can kill on turn 4 and has access to turn 3 kills. You know what I mean? Or like soft kills where it's like unable for you to win unless you win the game on the spot, which to be fair, there is a deck that can turn 3 now, Geological Appraiser in the format, but I think you're just very resilient. You get to mulligan very well. You get to main deck cards like Thalia, which are pretty good right now. And we're even seeing some innovations. You know, Zoe won the NRG and she played Trueheart Duelist, which is an adventure creature that also doubles as a removal spell. So there's a lot of stuff going on with the deck. I think it is very, very good. Some people have like joked or even said like it is not playable with the like change in the format. And I think that is just a misunderstanding of like, you need to be going fast and like winning the game if you're not controlling the game, right? Like it's kind of like we're either doing race cars or we're playing these long, drawn out like blue white control games. And I personally really like this deck. I love Warden of the Inner Sky. Such a huge upgrade of just smoothing your draw, and when the board stalls happen in matchups where that does occur, like the mirror, something like that, this is the card that pulls you way far ahead while being a one drop with a good static body. I think this deck is really, really strong, and I would happily play this, at the RC if you made me lock in right now. I think the deck's really, really good. I think it's been good for a long time and just underappreciated too. But the WoW upgrades were huge shots in the arms.
Yeah, I think people get this idea about the deck where it blew up too soon before the last Pioneer RC, and then was in everyone's sights, so it got really pinned down. But Warden, I don't think I've heard people describe it this way, but it's actually just how the card works, is that it gives a lot of your one drops effectively haste by piling power onto Warden the turn they come in, because you get two other... the first counter is effectively... if you play a Warden on turn 1, and turn 2 you play a Thraben Inspector, and that's all you have is just a Warden and an Inspector, and you put and the clue token, you put a counter on there, you effectively attack the Thraben Inspector because now your thing's a 2/3. Except that's also going to make it closer to being an evasive threat that's going to be able to go over things on its own. You're going to get a scry out of it. That's a really, really, really powerful thing to be able to do. And if you're opening on a Thraben Inspector into Warden, make it put a counter on it, Gleeful Demolition, put another counter on it, that's as good as a turn 2 Loxodon. And these are draws that are a lot easier to keep hands that aren't all in to do that. And it really is just a really good glue for the deck's doing, and it gives a lot of longevity and wins a lot of these board stalls that might happen in some matchups where you get stonewalled by having giving you an out and giving you a way to dig through to the cards you need to keep pace. So I think between that and then a lot of the changes in the format, and a lot of the work that's gone into the deck in making it better, and finding the right numbers on everything since the deck kind of burst onto the scene, all of that has led to this deck being a very strong tier 1 deck. And I think also the absence of mono green from the metagame helps that too, because I know that in my preparing for Dallas, something I felt was really just really damning about the Boros deck was that if I was playing against mono green and my opponent just played Karn and got a Sylex and then could blow it up after playing a troll or whatever, I couldn't win. It was really hard to beat a single Sylex as the Convoke deck, but there's way less of that now. You can't bring the green deck, so you don't have to worry about respecting the rules the green deck proposes of, can you get through my 4/4 that I'm playing on turn 2? My mana dorks into creatures and building a board presence. Can you beat that? It doesn't have to care about that anymore. That isn't the rules, and that has only opened the door for this deck to be even better.
Yep, I agree. Deck's great. Phoenix. This deck, speaking of great decks, has gotten a huge shot in the arm from WoW. Got Torch the Tower, which was a nice little upgrade for the deck. A little thing it could play. And dominated the Canadian RC. I think it was, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I think it was 5 Phoenix players in the top 8. Edgar Magalhaes lost in the top 8 playing Phoenix. The top 4 was all Phoenix, including blue-black splashing red for Phoenix, Arclight Phoenix, which I think really just shows there's a lot of room for these spell-heavy, cantrip-heavy decks in the format that's underexplored. And cards like Bitter Triumph are really helping enable that as a way to get the Arclight Phoenix out of your hand and catch all and just be a strong, powerful deck.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things going here. One, I think the Phoenix deck has been good, and even before Lost Caverns of Ixalan, it was one of the top contenders. It was a question of, is this deck edging out Rakdos now that it has the adventure creature that is helping kind of be more copies piece of the puzzle. It's getting a little bit more consistent, feeling Delve, and also having just some better stuff. Is that really pushing it over the edge? I think another thing that happened is, in a world of these discover combo decks, where the best ways to interact with them are to have soft counter magic and permission or cheap damage based removal that answers these 4-mana creatures or these 5-mana planeswalkers when they downtick. Both of those are things that Phoenix is uniquely perfectly equipped to be doing, right? If you're looking for a deck that gets to play soft counter magic that's efficient and removal that's efficient and doesn't have to be unconditional, it's the best thing in the format to do it. And especially if you need to be leaving up your mana in the early turns or kind of slowly developing, or need to kind of close a game when you get a window to, Phoenix is also the perfect deck for that, as we've seen with Temporal Trespass and Galvanic Iteration, kind of creating these unfair, I'll take 2 turns, now I'll get back my Phoenixes and attack you for 12 or 18, and then take my next turn and do it again. Being able to present that clock without slowing down the pace at which it's interacting is uniquely good for the format right now, and was naturally positioned to be answering the questions being asked on Pioneer too. So I think that it's hard for me to say if in a world where there's not the Discover decks that like you were saying, the blue-white decks kind of make you a little bit afraid because they're like the decks that are good at beating decks like Phoenix. In a world where there's not so much of the Discover combo stuff, are people able to go back to respecting the things that are good against like Phoenix, right? If people are playing a bunch of spot removal to try to beat these Brazier decks and these Elven decks, then bring back an Arclight Phoenix seems really good. They'll take off the table, but you're never going to run out of threats, even though they're playing more removal or more 1-1 answers, and you have your own. Whereas if people can go back to playing things like Go Blank or being able to afford, ley lines and rest in pieces or whatever it is they want to do to hate your graveyard, if that's something that they can do to shut you down as the Phoenix player, is your deck going to be okay? That's something that hasn't really been answered or have to be answered because that's not what the format's like right now. And I think that really has led to a lot of the success of the Phoenix deck, is that it gets to play, it's naturally positioned to get to play by the new rules of the format, in having access to a bunch of answers for decks like Convoke, like the Discover combo decks, while still having its tried and true methods against Rakdos and like control decks and Greasefang and Green and Ghoul, like all the other decks out there it already has plans for. It's really well explored, but it's good at handling the new ones too.
Yeah, I think the deck is good, and it's definitely part of this new litmus test, right? It's all right, can your deck beat, kind of, in my mind, the 4 new pillars are kind of Discover, Convoke, Blue White, and Phoenix. These are kind of the things you have to go through. And then you could argue Phoenix and Rakdos are in a very similar space, and we'll get to Rakdos soon. But, those kind of interactive decks need a way to look at it and be all right, this is the pressure that's on you now. What can you do? And it's a lot. We talked about with the Discover deck, it's well, you need to not be able to die, which means you have to hold up mana, which means you're basically Thalia the whole game, right? Your opponent just has a Thalia emblem on you. And that is very, very taxing. That's assuming you have a 1-mana answer to it, right? Most people don't have strong 1-mana answers to it. So it's definitely a weird place to be, for sure. Rakdos. I wish Ginger was here to talk about it. I'll say this. Misplaced Ginger, the Pioneer GOAT. This is the first time I think he hasn't top it in an Ursi. Playing Rakdos.
That's true.
Yeah, if there's ever a sign that Rakdos is struggling, this might be it, and specifically Rakdos midrange. I think the deck is fine, but not particularly great, and I mean that even more than normal. Where before I was kind of higher than most people on Rakdos, but still wasn't over the moon about it. I think you're in a really weird spot with the questions being asked by everyone. You're not very good against Convoke. I don't think you're super great against Geological or Contorious. I don't think you're super good against Phoenix. I think you have to play a bunch of sideboard cards to fix all these matchups, and they're pulling you in a lot of directions, and the rest of the format is still out there. Blue-White Control, I do kind of like your position against, typically. But, Abe, I'm curious what your kind of thoughts are, because it's a weird world for the Rakdos one-tricks.
Yeah, Rakdos is in an unfortunate spot where it's a deck that's able to pick 1 or 2 of the decks around that are pulling things in different directions of what they need to answer, to have plans for them and to have good answers for them. But when the format range is this broad in how people are playing games that are this condensed, or what ways interacting is best, especially in a world where like there's a deck, and multiple decks where your opponent can just kind of draw the right card and cast it, and if you don't have the answer, you lose on the spot. Like, that's so antithetical to the kind of game that Rakdos excels at playing that it makes sense to me why the deck is performing worse than it was before. And also, you know, the games are less about what Rakdos is traditionally good at handling. You know, Bone Crusher Giant is like, for a while, it was like, okay, this card is just oppressive to a lot of what people are trying to do. Like, I'll get a little bit of value by shutting down your creature or shutting down your development, and then I'll have a creature that attacks really well on a board of what's going on. That stuff, or like Fable the Mirror Breaker, like that stuff's so incremental. And even though the deck is so good at it, like that stuff is not as strong as it was because you don't get as much time to add up the pile of, you know, incremental value, or, you know, 2 for 1 here or there, or the fact that your deck is all, you know, all valuable creatures, or creatures that like reward you for having the game go on another turn. The games just don't go on as many turns, so the deck's just not as good, and you don't have as many opportunities to draw the right thing and have it at the right time, or eventually wear your opponent down on ways to like push out like, you know, you're like, they finally can't answer the Flip Fable or the Shieldred that's your last thing standing. You don't get to that point in the game. It's not about the last thing standing nearly as much anymore, and you can't drive games in that direction with the same consistency you used to be able to. So I think Rakdos is just kind of structurally in a place to be struggling. And while you could pick 1 or 2 of these matchups to be better against and have like better game plans against, it still feels like you can't cover everything. And even if you did that, your deck still might not be good enough in like the game ones for it to matter.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think it is a very awkward place to be, and I'm very curious to sort of see how they go about fixing it, because I don't know if they can, unless they do stuff like maybe play like Rolling Vortex, you know, and like totally change how their deck is playing. But that kind of stuff, while pretty easy to do with stuff like Blood Tithe Harvester and Fable in your deck, does change your matchups a little bit. So I don't know. We're going to have to see how players adapt to what's going on. Abe, that's kind of all the big players in Pioneer. When it comes to like sort of the established stuff, there's obviously so many decks in Pioneer. We could talk about them all day, like Lotus Field combo, etc. But I think, a lot of what we said about these other decks kind of apply to decks like that. So I'm curious, what is sort of going on in your mind? Is there any deck that you feel like we forgot about before we sort of talk about the format at large instead of, just these decks?
I think it's like important to check in on and just mention that like Lotus Field combo was still out there, although just not being as good a combo deck as some of these Appraiser decks. Greasefang really suffering in the same way of not being close to good enough, and also now having more players prepared with ways to just answer what they're doing. Like they're playing by all the wrong rules. So that deck has gone from at one point being one of the best decks in Pioneer and kind of like being talk of the town to being a deck I would put on the shelf if I have the opportunity to. And Rakdos Sacrifice also kind of falling by the wayside of decks that are just playing by the wrong rules. Like Rakdos being like Sacrifice being better when it was more about playing to the board. It's so not about that those decks have gone from solidly good repeated choices and even having like a number of one tricks who only play that archetype, to saying if you're someone who feels like that in the Pioneer format, they're like, oh, I can just play my, I'm a Sacrifice person, or like I just play like Hidden Strings every week. It might be a good time to think about what broadening your horizons looks like, because those decks don't look like they're going to be good as long as things are the way they are.
Yep, I agree. Um, yeah, and that kind of like transitions us to talking about the format at large. And I think everything Abe said there is true. And I think what you mentioned earlier about the rules of engagement have changed. Like what we're trying to fight against as the top decks has changed. The whole format is like very different. And the way that kind of only a ban or something truly game changing entering the format can do. And I think Discover combo is that game changing. So it's gonna be interesting to see sort of how things go forward. I've sort of let my preferences known as we get to sort of what we would play here. Um, Convoke is really high on my list. Phoenix I think is a totally good deck. I'm lower on blue white control than it sounds like Abe is, but I know I trust Abe a lot, and if Abe says it's good, then on no practice I would assume it's like a reasonable choice. And I think the Discover deck is really good. And kind of like the Four Pillars are kind of where I say like those are the great decks. I want other stuff to be good. Like I've got this, Rakdos Transmogrify deck over here on my screen that I want to queue up, and I want to try to find something to exploit. But right now, Pioneer is just a format that incentivizes kind of really going fast, winning the game on the spot, and also being able to play if you play a longer game, you have to be able to play the longer game against stuff like Blue White and Phoenix, which is really, really hard to do. And I think, it might just be a situation where we're in a couple deck metagame, and unless something changes, 1 week from this episode coming out, there will be a BNR announcement. That'll be our last chance for one before the RC. Unless something happens then, and I think it's likely, but unless something happens then, I think we're kind of in like choose one of those decks and then game, personally.
Yeah, I think it's a really weird spot to be in where there is something that's so strong and performed so well even 2 weeks out from showing up at what is reasonably the higher level of even the highest level that there is out there for competition for most things, as far as we're going to see big tournament data sets. That if the Appraiser combo decks are doing that well, or like starting to monetize to be that well, then maybe there is a possibility of a ban. But even without it, there's still a lot of ways you can approach the problem, and kind of finding a deck that works for you is possible. It might have to be something different than what's been, because the rules are so different. Personally, if I was playing the RC tomorrow, I don't know if I could pull the trigger on Lotus just yet. I did like the RC list from Japan, but I haven't really spent enough time with the archetype as a whole to feel like I know everything I'd want to know about playing a deck like that. Coming to things, it's not quite for the unprepared or the fast and loose like tournament play. So probably go with Convoke. I think that it's kind of a fail rate thing. It can't be that bad, and I think it is quite good. But if you're thinking about what it is you're looking at for the Pioneer format as it is, especially if you're thinking about for the RC coming up, and if nothing changes, what are you going to do? I think it's just important to know that the rules of engagement are quite different now than they were a month ago. You really need to be prepared to play a condensed game. Kind of in the sense that you have to be prepared to play a condensed game in Modern, or maybe you even had to be prepared to play a condensed game in Modern when Player Twin was legal, where sometimes the game can just end on turn 3 or 4, unless you're prepared to interact with that. And so if you're picking a deck that isn't going to be interacting with that a lot, you need to be on that same timeline, and then punish the deck that can punish the combo deck for not always having their fastest draw, but you consistently having a fast one. All those things I think are really important to take stock of when you're thinking about what deck you're playing, and move forward with that. As far as what things will look like, we'll have to see. But there's a lot you can do. There's a lot of even within the format as it is now, a lot of decisions to make, right? Like, do you think that people are going to play a lot of Phoenix and therefore you want to play blue white? Do you think people are going to maybe start getting into fighting between the fair decks and you want to play the combo deck because you think they'll stop respecting it as much? There's a lot of opportunity to really figure out where you want to be, and it's going to be a matter of doing your work on what's going to feel best for you.
Abe, I have a weird question for you. If I told you that you can either play Geological Appraiser or a random reasonable deck at the RC, which would you take? It's like a random box or the Appraiser deck. Which would you click?
The Appraiser deck.
I think so too. I'm thinking about like how well it's done with people knowing it existed, right? Like it's putting up reasonable win rates. It's open deck list, so you kind of know what your opponent's hate is, and if you can find more cards that help fix the common problems, it's really appealing. I kind of stand by Convoke or whatever, but I think for similar reasons, like you said, I do think that deck is good, and I just wanted to make sure that, like, I don't know. I feel like sometimes this happens where something new comes on the scene, people need to overreact to downplaying things because people overhype them, and like it's our job to kind of equalize. But I do want to make it kind of clear that I think Abe and I agree it is very good. And if you told me you were playing the deck at the RC, assuming the RC was tomorrow, I would be like, very reasonable. Seems like a strong deck, So, I don't know. Just want to take a moment to be like, deck is good. There's a reason that everyone's expecting it.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason, and I got to be, pretty candid here. Part of the reason that I'm not like, I'm of a mindset where I'm not sure I want to play it is also because I can't. I'm already qualified for the Pro Tour, right? So the RC in Atlanta coming up, I'm not like me playing the deck that's going to get me the best top 32 finish or whatever is not like on my radar as much as just playing things that I think give me a good shot of having a good tournament, like might be really good, well-positioned calls for the event that put me in position to really spike, and also making sure that at a level like the PT, I'm able to play things that aren't like super exploitable or, super known quantities. Like, if the Pro Tour was tomorrow, Mason, and I said you could play any of the reasonable decks or Appraiser combo, which do you think you'd take?
Probably the reasonable decks. But
that's how I feel too. I feel like people are going to have way better plans for the combo decks at like the Pro Tour, or it's just going to be something where people's decks are more hedged towards it and respect it a lot more because they don't want to be the people who aren't prepared. And for that reason, I want to make sure that I'm able to be in the crowd that's going to feel best. And so playing the combo deck hasn't really been on my radar personally as much. I think that, for a lot of people, it's probably a better choice than a lot of the reasonable decks out there to try to get in on the Appraiser combo. And I did want to make sure to make that clear. And candidly, why I'm kind of not talking really highly about it or haven't put a lot of time into it myself is because it's just not aligned with my goals right now. Yeah. But I do think the deck is really strong.
Yeah, you're looking for your world slot, baby. Win the tournament,
Exactly.
Yeah, we want that Abe at Worlds. And for me, like, I was talking to someone earlier today. I was like, if a genie appeared and was like, hey, you will get 32nd place exactly. You can't do better, you can't do worse. I'd be like, deal, sign me up. I'm in. And so, like, getting to play the Pro Tour is like what's up for me. So, like, there's some incentive to just pick a reasonably strong deck, and that's kind of like why I'm talking about it. It's like, yeah, Convoke is really good. How bad can it be? Maybe I'll play this Appraiser deck. It's really strong. It can combo kill people. Like if, I mentioned before, if I'm not really happy with anything else, I might as well be the person putting it to the question, and I'm not afraid to run into someone who brought in a billion hate cards and be like, okay, you got me, whatever. You came over-prepared, or maybe adequately prepared on how good the deck is for me. You win this one, hey, GG's, good luck on the rest, Like, that's going to happen to me, like, 4 times or whatever before I'm dead, And that could easily happen, but also maybe they disrespect it. Maybe they don't have good plans. Maybe they overestimate their plans, right? Maybe there's, like, a lot of player skill that can be done. I've watched some matches with the deck where I'm like, oh, wow, I think I would have done this because we're dead to this, and we can't lose if we play things this way. We're wait one turn, right? And instead they jammed and they ended up winning, and sometimes they get got, but, like, it's like, wow, there is a lot of play to this deck still. It is not just roll your face on the keyboard. So, just something to keep in mind, and I'm glad
very few things in Magic are.
Yeah, I honestly can't think of any deck that's really roll your face on the keyboard. At least not in any real format. Maybe there's some Pauper deck. I don't know. Vintage. But probably not. Anyways, that's going to do it for this week's check-in with Pioneer. I'll say this. I know Spencer tweeted last night that he really liked Phoenix, and he was saying that, like, if he had to lock in a deck, it'd be Phoenix. And so, that was Spencer. We didn't really talk to him, and he's not here. I don't want to speak too much on his behalf, but I know that at least as of 25 hours ago or whatever, he was like Phoenix thumbs up emoji. And so that might be a little something to throw in here that, don't know his exact reasons on it. It's on his Twitter. You can follow him there. But regardless, that was this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. Thank you all so much for listening to that part of it. We don't have any Patreon question or anything this week because we actually just did a mailbag episode and we didn't get any new ones in before we started coming up here. But you can get your question right on the show by going to patreon.com/ccmtg to support the show. You get in our Discord. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of awesome things going on there. You get to ask questions on the show. You get to listen to the show early when we do it live recording. So that's really exciting. So make sure you want to support the show there. It'll always be free, but we do appreciate it. And then another way to get interaction on the show and support us is actually stuff like sharing the show with your friends and going to YouTube and, sort of leaving comments. We had one the other day that was Pump the Brakes is a great Will Smith song with Snoop Dogg, along with being sound advice. I think I missed that part of last week's episode. I wasn't here. I don't know what happened, but
yeah, I was talking about pumping the brakes being an important thing to do. And at some things it might always improving. Mm-hmm. And Spencer really liked that. Really like pumping the brakes. And I do. I say pump the brakes a lot, and I think people don't think about it as much as maybe they should. To say we can slow the pace down here for a second. Just take a sec to think. Mm-hmm. But yeah, great song. Will Smith, Snoop Dogg, classic.
I learned something new. I never heard of that song before. I'll have to Spotify after this. But if you want to join the conversation, you can go to all of those places or follow us on Twitter. You can find me at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/the Mason Clark. You can find me for coaching, there on email, which is at masoneClark@gmail.com. And you can find me over on Twitter, Mason E. Clark. You can DM me there to inquire about coaching. I have a few slots left between now and the RC when it comes to time being scheduled. It is getting very booked up in advance, as you might imagine. At the time of this recording, we're still in November. That's December 14th. So if you're curious about that, make sure to reach out sooner than later. And I think that is it. I guess I can say this officially here. I typically in the past I'm like, oh, check out Card Kingdom for my articles or whatever. Card Kingdom is ending its 60 card support format for right now, so thank you so much for Card Kingdom for everything they kind of did for me. If you've been wondering where my stuff is gone or whatever, there should be one last article coming out this week, and then it's going to be over. No more Card Kingdom stuff. So thank you so much for the support for, I guess it was like 4 years that I wrote for them weekly. They really helped me a lot, and they really helped me, build my platform and grow my voice, since I know some of y'all found the show because of that, and vice versa. So thank you so much to them. But I just wanted to give a shout out to that. Like, that will not be a place where my written content goes anymore. So more on that in the future. But Abe, what about you?
People can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. I actually am not going to have any more availability for coaching for a bit from now through the Pro Tour. If you want to set something up for after that, or if you're someone who I've worked with before at all, I will probably be able to slot you in because we'd be kind of picking up where we left off. But otherwise, I just don't have the time to pick them up. But you'd be in good hands with Mason or Spencer. At this time, I really got to plug them as being two people who I learn a lot from, and feel like very confident and comfortable putting the feeler out there, saying give them the shot. So that's it really for me. Twitter, follow me for tweets about music and magic. That's really all I talk about these days. So
as you should. What else is it? Anime every now and again, right? A little Blue Lock.
A little bit of anime for the boys.
Yeah. I always rate them 10 out of 10 because the boys rock. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. We'll see you back next week for another episode of CC MTG.